Well, it's been a year of owning the Engwe M20, and if I'm still riding it after 1,200 miles, it must be good. Right? This bike is my primary winter commuter, and it shows. It is dirty, rusty, and so far I've replaced or upgraded tires, brakes, forks, shocks, suspension pivot, chainring, freewheel, seat, mirror, handguards, blinkers, bags, lock, and a cargo box. Now, all that might sound like an awful lot, and it kind of is. So let's take a look at what exactly I've had to replace and maintain on this thing, and just how I feel about an Engwe e-bike after owning one for 1 year. First, let's talk about the upgrades. The bike looks wildly different from when I first unboxed it. Some of the more simple items are obvious and pretty typical, like the mirror. For winter commutes, I added these cheap handguards which are flimsy but do a great job of keeping the cold wind from penetrating my gloves while winter commuting. Of course I need storage while commuting, so I added a small frame bag along with a 3D printed adapter for this little field box on the tail. In a previous video, I tore apart the forks and upgraded the rear shock. In yet another video, I covered how to make a seat riser, boosted my motor power, and added a larger chainring. The chainring helps with the gear ratio, but I wound up throwing a smaller freewheel on the rear wheel as well during my most recent tire change. The headlights and taillights are plenty good on this bike, but I also threw a set of blinkers for night riding and a bit of extra visibility while turning. These run directly off of 48 volts, so they are very easy to install, replacing the headlight bolts on the front and bolting onto the taillight bracket in the rear. It's probably not everybody's taste, but I do like how this bike looks now. It's very functional and sort of resembles like a mini adventure bike. Well, upgrades are great, but they're optional. Not so much so when things break. So, what have I had to do for maintenance and repairs? Well, thankfully nothing has outright broke on this bike, but things sure do like to wear out. The biggest, most fundamental problem on this bike is the suspension. The forks are quite frankly junk. Likewise, the stock rear shock is also junk, so I swapped that out. That was an easy replacement, but a far more serious problem is the suspension pivot. At only around 800 miles, I noticed that the entire rear swing arm would audibly clunk left and right by a few millimeters every time I pedaled. This singular narrow joint is responsible for holding the entire rear end of the bike straight while allowing suspension travel. It should really be something like large ball bearings or Delrin bushings, but what I found were these extremely underwhelming plain rolled bronze bushings. I debated replacing them with identical ones, but I tried printing my own in TPU. I've seen people use TPU for full-size car bushings, so I figured it was worth a shot, and honestly, these feel way better than the stock bushings. Time will tell how they hold up, but after around 300 miles, they're still holding rock solid without any notable play. Finally, I was debating on whether or not to even include this, but I did modify the dropouts for the rear axle. The torque of an e-bike motor is entirely taken by the flat spots on the axle, but the dropouts on the M20 are improperly sized, preventing the axle from fully seating down into it. I was worried that the torque would eventually round out the dropouts, causing a failure, so I 3D printed a template and used a router bit to modify the profile on the dropouts, allowing the motor axle to fully seat up into it. I would really only recommend this to someone with tons of experience doing precision work with a rotary tool, and an alternative would be to simply just fit a torque arm to the axle, preventing rotation. So ultimately, do I still recommend the M20? It depends. I've seen a lot of people complain about these online bikes saying they're cheap, and yeah, that's kind of the point. They've got cheaper components, but they're also really cheap to get into. And that's kind of the nice thing, is you get some extra money that you can spend on upgrades and things that you like. Now, for someone like me who knows how to work on bikes, something like this makes a lot of sense. To replace a freewheel or a bottom bracket or a chain, it's nothing for me. But if you don't know bike maintenance as well, and you're bringing this to the bike shop every other month, well, the cost savings isn't really making much sense anymore. So would I recommend a bike like this to somebody who likes to tinker? Absolutely. It's a lot of fun to tinker on. They're cheap to work on. You can add a lot of cool accessories and really make it your own bike. Now, despite the problems I have had with this thing, nothing is actually outright broke, and nothing seemed like it was actually a safety problem. And I've been winter commuting with this thing, and it's been pretty much a champ. It's always got me there. So I think the reliability can be there. There's just a couple things that wear out quickly. And that brings up my final point about the M20. It is phenomenal for what it is, and what it is a cheap electric moped. It's really fun as a moped, and I love commuting around town on it, but when it comes down to it, it's kind of a terrible bicycle. If you want to ride primarily on bike trails or get exercise, you're way better off with something else. On the flip side, if you just want a little town commuter or as an alternative to like an electric scooter or a gas moped, it's great fun and it has really cool looks at a reasonable price. Now, there are often a lot of bike reviews talking about how great something is out of the box, but I don't see follow-ups as often, so hopefully this little update gives some insight as to how these bikes really hold up over time. I know that the bike videos can also get a little bit repetitive, so I do have a different kind of video planned about a peculiar vintage robot in the works, so if something like that interests you, make sure to hit the bell icon to stay notified. As always, thanks for watching.